Hello and welcome to Live from Currituck Extension. My name is Adam Fromell. I'm the county's agriculture extension agent. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about growing grapes. This is kind of following the series I've been doing over the past few months, where we covered things like peaches, blueberries, caneberries, strawberries, that kind of thing. So it's going to follow a similar format where we're going through things that are in our teaching orchard behind the office. And in the next few weeks, couple months, we'll be offering in-class versions of this where you'll be able to come out and check out our orchard and see what we've done here. But until that, we're going to keep doing this series. Today, we're going to talk about growing grapes, and we've got a lot of links in the description below so you can check out where we get this information from. You can see our website, so if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email there, especially if you're watching this recorded. If you're watching this live, you can type your questions down in the chat, whether you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, and I'll answer them throughout the presentation. We also have links in our description for our social media, and we've done a lot of posting recently, so check that out. And then an evaluation, if you've got some time, fill that out and let us know how we're doing, how I did today, and some other things that you're interested in as we continue to do this live stream. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started and start to talk about growing grapes. So if my slide will come up. For an overview, I usually show some of the things that I'm going to talk about before we get into the presentation. And I'm going to stop throughout each one of these points. So if you have any questions, type them down in the chat and I'll answer them after each one of these sections. But we're going to talk about site and cultivar selection first, where you should plant your grapes, what type to grow, that sort of thing, what's going to work best in this area. Then we're going to move on and talk about planting, how to do it properly, and then how to trellis your grapes. And that's really important when we're talking about how do you establish your grapes. Then we'll move on and talk about maintenance, some of the things that you need to be doing year after year so you'll have healthy grapes. And if you watched any of the other presentations I've done, this is usually the longest part. But for grapes, it's actually pretty easy. And so it's going to be a short section. And then we'll finish talking about some of the insects and diseases that you might encounter. And some of these diseases will dictate what type of grapes that you can grow in this area. So that's an important section as well. Of course, if you have questions, type them in the chat. And if you're watching this recorded, you can shoot me an email and you'll find that on our website. Of course, the link's in the description. So if you watch any of the other ones, I always start with site selection, and the slide pretty much always looks like this. For all of our fruit, they grow really well in areas that get full sunlight. So that's what you should be shooting for when you're trying to pick out where you should grow your grapes. They do best in full sun. They will grow in some partial shade, but full sun is the best. Again, more of the things that you can do that are going to be beneficial for your grapes, putting them in an optimal location, getting optimal nutrients, and planting them properly is going to help you in the long run avoid diseases and things like that. So that's the goal for your grapes and should be your goal when you're planting. They also like well-drained soils like all of our other fruits. With other fruits, you can kind of get around it by planting on mounds, and that's not really as possible with grapes. You can still do it, but it doesn't work quite as well. Now, if you're not sure what I mean by well-drained soil, what you'll do is dig a hole that's about 2 feet deep. You can use post hole diggers. You can use shovels, trowels will work as well. And you're going to dig it 2 feet down and then see how quickly does the water drain out of that hole. If it's a dry week or dry couple of days, you might not have any water in that hole, so you'll add a couple, just add some with a hose or a bucket and see, can it drain properly in about a day or two? If it does, you should be fine to grow grapes there. If not, you might want to try another area in your lawn. So that's site selection. It's pretty similar for all of our fruiting plants. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between grapes. Many people are familiar with bunch grapes. The things that you can get in stores are usually a type of bunch grape. Then there's wine grapes, which are used exclusively for making wine. There's different varieties, of course, between your reds, purples, and your white grapes. There's differences between those. And then there's muscadines, which are local to this area, eastern North Carolina. A lot of people call them scuppernongs. It's named after the Scuppernong River, a little bit further south in North Carolina here. So if you've heard of that, that's where that name comes from. Muscadines grow really well in this area because they're native to this area. So I always recommend to grow muscadines. They're really disease resistant compared to some of our other grapes. Now, Because of that, we're going to talk mostly about Muscadine grapes in this presentation. Our other grapes are grown in areas further west in the state, in the mountains, in New York, in some of our colder climates. And so we don't recommend growing any of those grapes in this area because the disease pressure is really too high for most people, most homeowners. So if you want to grow grapes, muscadines are the way to go. Now, with that being said, if you do want to grow some of these other types, just know that you're going to have issues with disease and that kind of thing. It might be harder to get them established. If you want help with that, you can send me an email or give me a call and I can help you along the way, because we do have some resources, but it's going to be much, much more difficult than growing muscadines. So we're going to continue with muscadines for most of this presentation. And when you're going to pick your muscadines, you can pick varieties that are best for wine or juices. It's going to be more of a sweeter grape, or you can get fresh market. That's just if you're going to pick them and eat them. So those are kind of the differences there. If you are growing muscadines or planning on growing them, just know that they do have seeds, all varieties, and the skin can be tough. So that might deter you from choosing muscadines over another type of grape. But I think that's kind of some of the fun of muscadines. Almost kind of reminds me of eating watermelons with seeds. It's just part of the fun of growing muscadines. But there's a lot of varieties out. As you can see, this chart is from one of the links in our description below, the Muscadine grape guide from NC State. And there's a lot of different varieties, and depending on what you're looking for. A lot of our box stores will, like Lowe's and Home Depot, will have these varieties. So check those out. But that's really all we have for our site and our cultivar selection. If you have any questions, you can type them down in the chat or shoot me an email, and I'll take a second if anybody's got any. Check out the chat, but if not, we're going to move on to planting and trellising. So I don't see any questions, so we're going to move on to planting and trellising. Again, a lot of these initial things that you do before you actually get your grapes established will help you in the long term. So I always recommend with anything that you're going to plant, to take a soil sample. It tells you what kind of nutrients you need and the pH. How do you need to adjust that? And that's critical because if your pH isn't at the proper acidity or basic, if you don't have the proper pH, you might not get enough nutrients into your plant because a lot of that is tied together. So we always recommend taking a soil sample. It's free to do. It's really easy. We've got a lot of videos if you need any help. But you'll just pick up a box and a form from us here at our office. It's free from April through Thanksgiving, so that's when we recommend to do it. And you'll just go around your yard, wherever you want to plant your grapes, and you'll dig holes that are about 3 to 5 inches deep, and you'll remove that top inch of soil because it has grass and things like that that'll throw off the results. You'll mix those together in a bucket, and then you put them in one of these brown boxes, and we'll ship them off, and then they'll tell you how much nutrients you need to add if you need to adjust the pH. So we recommend doing a soil sample. If you're doing it for grapes, I'd recommend to do it in September or October. That'll give you time to get your results back, and then you'll be able to adjust your soil before you plant your grapes, which happens to be the next slide. So when you're planting your grapes, the best time to do it is in the winter or early spring. A lot of this for homeowners depends on when the box stores get them, which I completely understand. March is a good time because it's after most of our heavy frosts. We might still get a couple of days, and this year's a kind of a great example. We had a frost in May, but those aren't going to be hard frosts that are going to kill your grapes. So you're going to want to plant them in March. The plants need to be spaced about 10 feet apart. That gives them room to grow, but also you don't want your plants too close together. They'll end up becoming a viney mess, and you'll have issues with airflow. And airflow is a big problem because you can get diseases and insects in your plants. Now, while we're talking about spacing, you want your rows about 8 feet apart. That allows you to mow in between them. Again, gives you more space between your plants. And then when you're actually planting them, if you get them in a container, you'll bury it just to that soil level. If you get a bare root, you're going to bury it so the graft is 3 to 4 inches above the soil line. And the graft is where they attach the top part of the grape to the roots of another variety. So that's kind of an easy area to tell. Now, when you're digging your hole, you want it to be about twice the size, twice the width, and twice the depth of the container. And that's a general rule for all of your plants when you're planting your grapes. Now, before you do that, you'll want to think about what type of trellis you want to do. and the size and the logistics of that. Trellising is really important for all grapes. They must be trellised. And it's funny, our publication says there's a lot of trellises out there, but there aren't that many that are efficient or effective. And so I like the single wire method because it's pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple, but it works well to grow grapes. So for the single wire system, you'll have the plant in the middle, and you'll have two 4x4x8s on the end. Those are your posts that you're going to attach the wire to. You want to sink those 2 feet in the ground. That'll provide a nice sturdy base for the wire to withhold all of the weight of the grapevine. And then you'll want to use a 9-gauge wire that's 5 feet high. And that's the height that you want for your grapevine. So those vines are going to grow up to 5 feet tall and then spread out, kind of like the bottom image there. And like I said, it uses a single wire. So we're going to be working on ours later this week, our grapevine trellis. And so I've actually got some of that wire here. Let's see if I can get a better image. So this is a 9-gauge wire. It's really thick. It's really sturdy, really hard. So that'll be great for our grapes to grow on. And then you can attach it to your 4x4s in a number of ways. We're going to use these trellis anchors. And so it's kind of like a little cone. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a little cone. And so the wire goes in one direction and then it can't come back out. So that's an easy way. You just, if you can see on there, you just screw it in to your post. So that's how we plan on attaching our wire to our trellis here at the office. But again, trellising is really important for all types of grapes. Now, once you've put the trellis in and you've planted your grapes, you need to start to train it to the trellis. And that means just growing the vine so it will grow up and grow onto the trellis. So when you do that, you want to prune your grape to a single stem. And what I mean by that is that it just has one stem that's coming up. It'll try to put branches out the sides, and you just prune those right off. And you'll do that until the plant grows all the way up to the wire. And now, how is it going to get to the wire? You need to put a stake in the ground. Whether it's a wood stake like they have here, you can use a T-post. You can use kind of a bamboo stake. Any of those will work. And then you need to kind of attach the vine or the trunk to that stake. You can use twist ties. They make a lot of them that you can get at the plant stores or the box stores like Lowe's and Home Depot. They're almost like bread ties, and you just twist them lightly to attach it to the stake, and you just continue to do that as the vine grows up. You don't want to put them on too tight because that might girdle your plant, which is where it rubs off part of the bark, and that's where all of the water and the food for the plant go up and down the stem. So if you do that, you'll kill the plant. This image here, they use duct tape, and I wouldn't recommend that because you're likely to girdle the plant. But this image does do a good job of showing it being trained up the stake. And then once it gets to the top of that stake, you're going to prune off the top. And when you do that, it makes the plant want to grow sideways. And so that should be your goal in the second year, is for the plant to grow sideways. And I'll show the next images here of kind of the timeline of this training system. So if you look kind of in the center image on the top row, it has a vine that's growing around that stake. That's what you want to happen in year one as you're training it up to reach your trellis. And then in the bottom kind of shows you the progression between year one and year two. So in the winter, that's what your plant is going to look like. Again, you're removing all of those branches that are going to be growing sideways until it's just below that wire. And then once it gets below that wire, you trim off the top. And then in the spring image, you'll see it starts to grow laterally across the wire. And you might have to twist tie it to the wire to help it along the way. But you want to make sure you're doing that. Make sure that you only have one vine growing or one branch growing in each direction. And that'll help you have a stable plant. So you'll do that, pruning off anything that's trying to grow down. You want to grow for that second year all the way across your wire. And so you can see at the bottom there where it says summer, that should be your goal for the first and second year. First year is growing up to the wire. The second year is growing across the wire. And that's pretty much training a grapevine. It might be a little bit quicker depending on how vigorous the plant you have, but that should be your general goal for planting and trellising your grapes. So that can be confusing. If you have any questions, we're going to stop now and I'll answer those. So you can type them in the chat or you can shoot me an email. And just remember, again, this is for muscadines. There's a little bit of differences when you're trellising some of your bunch grapes or your grapes that are for wine. But muscadines, a single wire really works best. You can do a double, but again, with muscadines, they grow so vigorously that you're going to get a lot of branching, a lot of vegetation up there. So a single wire really works fine. But I don't see any questions, so we're going to move on to the maintenance section now. So the first thing, usually I start off talking about mulching, keeping down the weeds. And I don't have a slide for that in this presentation because you don't mulch your grapes. All you need to do is mow underneath of them, keep those weeds down, but you don't want to mulch them. It's going to introduce diseases and insects. And there's a vine borer that will bore into the stem of your grapevine, so you don't want to put any mulch around your muscadines. So that makes it a little bit easier in that sense. It's a little bit more difficult when we talk about adding fertilizers because there's a different scheme for each year depending on your plant. Now, for the first year, you're going to be putting down a 1/4 pound of a general fertilizer like a 10-10-10. And the recommendation is to put it down at planting. I usually don't recommend to put down fertilizer at planting because you have the potential to burn the roots. When you first plant a plant, the main goal is for the roots to kind of establish. So I would actually wait about 2 to 4 weeks before you put down that fertilizer for your new plant. After that first fertilization, you're going to continue to apply a 1/4 pound per plant every 6 weeks until July. So it's pretty easy to do. Just every 6 weeks, go out and put out some fertilizer. That'll allow your plant to grow pretty quickly and hopefully reach that trellis in that first year. Now, the reason that you're stopping in July is because fertilizer takes about 4 to 6 weeks, 2 weeks. It takes a while to incorporate into the soil and for the plants to take it up. And so if you apply too late in the year, like you're applying in the end of July or August, that plant isn't going to get that until September, and it's going to try to continue to grow throughout the fall when it should be preparing for dormancy in the winter. So you don't want to apply too late in the year. So that's year one. Year two, you're going to be increasing the amount, but decreasing how much you fertilize. So you're going to be putting out a 1/2 pound now in March, May, and July. So basically every other month. So about every 8 weeks instead of 6 weeks. So that's year two. Year three, you're going to reduce even further. You're only going to apply in March and June, but you're going to put out 1 to 2 pounds of fertilizer. And this really depends. In year three, I would say start with 1, unless your plants are really hungry. Then you might want to put out 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds, something like that. Of course, in between all of these, you can take soil samples if you're worried you're putting out too much or too little, or if you're worried that the soil pH has changed. And I always recommend to do that. The samples are really easy to take. They don't take that long. And like I said, they're free from April through Thanksgiving. So you can take your samples in the spring if you think you're having issues. Now, when you're putting out fertilizer, you want to put it in a ring, a circle about 1 foot to 2 feet around the trunk of your grapevine. That'll allow it to go straight to the roots. And you want to be watering it in. So you put it out on a dry day and then just water it in. That way it starts to go down into the soil. You can also let the rain do it for you, but I would say do it only when you're going to get maybe 2/10 of an inch. Anything more than that, and you risk that fertilizer being washed into our water, and that's not something that you want to happen. So that's fertilizing your grapes. It's pretty easy. You're just adding a little bit more each year and just doing it less often. Now, the next thing to talk about is pruning, and it's fairly similar to trellising. This is going to happen after year 2 and on, once that vine has reached the entire length of the trellis. So in this image, you can see on the left, hopefully, that the plant is unpruned. The vines are growing straight down. That's what you'll see with the muscadine. And then on the right, they show what it should look like after it's been pruned. So you're removing a lot of these vines when you're pruning. And you're going to be doing this in January or February. Probably the end of January works best. What you're going to do is prune back to what they call 2 to 3 bud spurs. And that just means when you look at those individual vines, you can see 2 or 3 buds. That's where you're going to have your grapes for the following year. So you want to make sure that you're not pruning, excuse me, you're not pruning all of that vine back. So just leave 2 or 3 of those and you'll have plenty of growth for your plant. But pruning for grapes is a lot easier than some of our other plants because it's really not as critical. You just want to leave some of them on there. When we talk about something like peaches or blueberries, you really have to worry about the structure of the tree. But that's not the case with grapes. So that's really the maintenance. It's pretty easy for grapes compared to some of our other stuff. Of course, if you have any questions when you're doing this in the winter months, you can send me an email, or if you have any questions now, you can type them down in the chat before we get to our last section on insects and disease. So it doesn't look like we have any. So if you have them, feel free to add them at any point, but we're going to move on to our last section about insects and disease. And this is kind of a big brown insect. I know it's not an insect, but deer are one of the main concerns with grapes, especially when they're young. So grapes, especially muscadines, are native to this area, and so are deer. So they've kind of grown together, and deer really love grapevines. So you'll need to protect them when they're young. In that first and second year, the deer can do a lot of damage because that's when your grapevines are being trained to the trellis. So it's really crucial that you get the right shape. To prevent this, what you can do is put a cage around your plants, and that'll prevent them from going in there and eating the vine. The thing you want to worry about the most is them damaging the tip, because you don't want that vine to start to grow laterally before it's reached that trellis. But as a deer, they're one of the main pests, deer and rabbits, and that's kind of what the damage looks like there in that picture. The next one are Japanese beetles. They're usually not an issue. Again, if they come early in the grape's life, in year 1 or 2, they can cause quite a bit of damage and slow the growth. But other than that, they're usually not a problem. I usually don't do anything to get rid of them unless they start to feed on the grapes themselves. And you might see that happen. So there's a number of things that you can spray on grapes, a lot of pesticides out there that you can get rid of them. So you can look those up and find them at your box stores, or shoot me an email. But other things that work are Japanese beetle traps. They kind of just draw the Japanese beetles away from your grapevines. So you want to put them about 50 to 100 feet away from your grapevines. And that way you're drawing them away. They'll get collected in the bags, and then you can throw the bags away and replace them if you've got a lot of Japanese beetles. But I really like to use Japanese beetle traps. I've seen them fill up with Japanese beetles in a day. You can really reduce their population by using those traps. So that's what I recommend for those, unless they start to eat your grapes, and then you might want to think about adding an insecticide to your treatment. The last thing we're going to talk about is the reason that we don't grow a lot of wine grapes and other bunch grapes in this area, and why I recommend muscadines. And maybe I should have added this slide at the beginning, but this is a disease called Pierce's disease. And it's a bacteria that spreads throughout the grapes and causes this burn look to them. It'll eventually kill off the grapevines. Happens pretty quickly. And it's spread by a lot of what's called sharpshooter insects. They're kind of similar to something like a cicada, but they're really small. And they're really common in this area. That's why we don't grow very many bunch grapes or have very many vineyards in the area, because they're pretty much all over the place. They spread the disease easily. The nice thing is muscadines aren't as susceptible. So you might have a plant that gets Pierce's disease. It doesn't kill the plant, and the plant deals with it and grows on fine. But if you are growing other grapes, this is going to be a big limitation. The problem is these insects are in all sorts of different types of grasses. So you really want to keep the weeds down near your grapes. And they can be hard to spray. So with muscadines, hopefully it's not going to be an issue for you. Like I said, a lot of ours are resistant. Most of them are resistant because they live in this area with these insects. Our other grapes are from Europe, and so they're not resistant to Pierce's disease. But this is the main one to worry about. There's also a lot of other insects out there that will feed on grapes that I didn't include in this presentation, because with muscadines, they're kind of sporadic. You might have a stink bug come, and maybe you have one bad year of stink bugs, then you never see them again. Or you might have great berry moth come one year, then you never see them again. So if you do find any of these insects, take a picture and send it to me, and I'll help you identify them and figure out how to deal with them properly. But there's so many that are kind of sporadic and may never be an issue that I didn't include them in this presentation. But that's all we have from insects and diseases. If you have any questions about that or anything in this presentation, add them to the chat. or shoot me an email and I'll answer them. But while we're waiting on the last questions to come in, if you have any, make sure that you stay tuned for Wednesday's episode, now that we're doing Monday, Wednesday, and Friday episodes, where Olivia will be doing a dehydration class. She'll be doing fruit leather, which is kind of cool and kind of a way to eat healthy, a fun activity for families. So check that out if you're interested. That's going to be at 11:30 on Wednesday. And also, if you have time, fill out our evaluation. We read all of those. We appreciate all the time that y'all take to do those. It only is a couple minutes, a few questions, but it definitely helps us decide what we're going to do. But it doesn't look like we have any questions. So thank y'all for watching. We appreciate y'all. And stay tuned for Wednesday's episode at 11:30 of Live from Currituck Extension.